Good to hear
Welcome,
your
both of
voice.
you, my big audience. I'm going to share the screen now. Okay. Give me a moment. I'm new to this. Okay. Today's topic is global climate change. What can we do, and what is sea level rise? Joe's already seen this. I don't know if Jonathan has, but I was just going to show this for people who aren't familiar with EARTHCARE. So it's just going to be a very short video about the different things EARTHCARE is involved in. So what is global climate change? What's the deal with carbon? What's the greenhouse effect? How do we know climate's changing? What's happening in the oceans? What can we do to help? And what do we not know? There's so many big questions. Well, back in the days when I was a college student, global climate change wasn't a thing. It was called global warming. It was within the past 10 years or so that scientists decided to change it to climate change. But basically, we have put so many polluting gases into the atmosphere that it's created a little blanket. Oh, well, not a little blanket, a large blanket around the entire globe of the Earth. And that has had a weird effect of keeping heat in and not letting it deflect back out into space like it normally did for millennia. And this is pretty much started to happen in a big way when we had the Industrial Revolution, which started in the 1800s, when men figured out how to create machines, and the machines were powered by fossil fuels, gasoline, diesel, and of course those emit fumes. And so with the advent of factories and industries and lots of cars and trucks and trains and planes, we've now put so much of those polluting emissions into the atmosphere that we've actually changed our atmosphere, the chemical components in our atmosphere. And so that has in turn affected the way our weather patterns are operating. So the big deal with carbon is that carbon is one of the most, well, it is the most harmful of the greenhouse gases. The other greenhouse gases are components of nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. They got sulfur dioxide and various types of phosphates and nitrates. But in combination, they've done a number on our climate. So the greenhouse effect is what I just described. The heat comes in from the sun, and it's, rather than being reflected back out into space, it's held in, and it's actually to the point now where it's increasing the temperature overall of the entire Earth, which is not good for certain animals and definitely not good for humans. Also, it's affecting our plants. I'll get into that a little bit later. But how we know climate is changing, basically they started really recording weather patterns, rainfall, and how many storms we get. I think in the early 1900s, they started to really keep a pretty good record. And now meteorology is a career. And so we've got a lot of people who are studying, the weather is their life. They study it and they tell us what's going to happen. Now, what's happening in our oceans is equally disturbing because the ocean is a carbon sink. So basically, the ocean can take carbon in, and it used to just be able to take it in and neutralize it and put it back into the cycle of, you know, the water going into the weather, different, anyway, rain and precipitation, that whole cycle. But what's happened now is the oceans, we've changed the chemistry of the oceans as well as the atmosphere. So now the oceans are actually acidifying, which is not good for a lot of the carbonate-based animals like conchs and crabs and lobster. Anything that has a shell that has a lot of carbonate in it is not going to do well in acid conditions. The acid will wear away at the shell, which is really not good. So that's one thing that's happening in the oceans. That people really, a lot of people really aren't aware of. I'm going to talk about what we can do to help a little bit later. But what do we know now, or what do we not know? There's a lot we don't know. There's scientists who've been working on the problem of climate change for decades, and the one thing they all agree on is they don't know what's going to happen or when exactly. They have an idea because we're actually documenting the ice, the glacial ice in the both poles, Antarctic and Arctic. We are seeing big glaciers that have been intact for years and thousands of years now are melting and falling into the ocean and just disappearing. That's what's causing our sea level rise. Um, so I was talking about the ocean. This is diadema. It's a long-spined sea urchin that used to be very, very prevalent on our shores, to the point where if you walked in barefoot in the water, you had to look out for them, because if you stepped on one, you get them in your feet. Now they're quite rare because in the 80s and 90s, we had several summers of way too hot water. And these particular animals are very temperature sensitive. So when the water was hot for many, many weeks and months, it got too hot for them, they died. So basically for in the 80s and 90s, this particular species was basically extinct. Thankfully, I've seen it starting to come back. I've seen it here and there, but it's nowhere in the numbers that it used to be back in the 80s and 90s. But thankfully, it's not completely extinct, which is what I had thought during the 90s. Another problem with our warming oceans is we're getting corals dying. And this is a picture of what they call coral bleaching, which when coral are very temperature sensitive, also very sensitive to having pristine salt water, seawater. So if there's a lot of nutrients like nitrates and phosphates that come as runoff from golf courses and that sort of thing, the coral will exhibit this coral bleaching. And what coral bleaching is where, if you know about coral, coral is actually two organisms living symbiotically together. You've got microalgae that live within the tissues of the coral, and they produce 40% of the coral's nutrition just by photosynthesizing. But what happens when there's chemicals in the water and too hot water for too long, the coral will expel the algae. The algae will just be released into the water and wash away. And where that happens, the coral tissue turns white and dies. So that's what's called coral bleaching. So all this coral that you see that's white, that's dead coral. The brown coral are still alive, but the white pieces you see here in this slide are dead. So this is a better slide of the greenhouse effect. So you've got the sun bringing the solar radiation in, and normally a good portion of that is reflected back out into the atmosphere. But when you have the greenhouse effect, you've got that layer now of gases that we've polluted the air with. Now those sun's rays are kept in, and it acts like an electric blanket. And we've got the electric blanket plugged in, and it's no one's turning it off. So that's what's causing all of these problems. This is not a good slide. It's kind of blurry, but this has a good way of showing you all the things that are connected to climate change. In the center, we have human health, because what's going to happen when everything gets warmer, we're going to have vectors like mosquitoes and dengue fever and all sorts of horrible pathogens that are going to do well because they do well in hotter temperatures. You're going to have stratospheric ozone depletion, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem function loss. Biodiversity loss because certain animals like the corals, they require certain conditions. And once those conditions aren't available, you're going to see die-offs of those organisms. You're going to see freshwater decline because we're going to have the sea level rising, and so places with freshwater tables that you depend on that's going to be harder to find. And on land, you're going to have desertification or land degradation. So you're seeing that a lot in places like Africa. And actually now I think I'm seeing it in South America a bit. So it's not good. And this is a picture of what I was talking about. We've got the power plants, the factories, and they're all just spewing out fossil fuel uh, products, from burning of oil and diesel. And it's the thing is, for us as the Bahamas, a small island developing state, we don't produce as much of this as the rest of the world does. And the big countries that do produce a lot of the greenhouse gases are the US and India and China. Um, and really, unless those big countries do something to curtail their emissions, countries like ours that are low-lying are going to suffer. You also got another thing that causes climate change, which is deforestation. And unfortunately, our Bahamian government has allowed a lot of deforestation to one of the most valuable plants that we can have, which is our mangrove forests. Our mangrove forests protect us from storms. They also are a fish nursery for every kind of animal you can imagine that lives in the ocean. And they build land. The prop roots actually build land. Um, this I don't think is a slide of a mangrove forest, but one thing I want to mention, no, I'll mention that in the next slide, sorry. So an effect of climate change is we're seeing larger and more stronger and virulent storms, tornadoes, rainstorms, everything associated with weather. All of those phenomena are getting bigger and badder. And we as Grand Bahamians and Abaconians know full well that the climate change hurricanes that we've been experiencing, such as Dorian and Floyd and Francis and Jean, are nothing to play with. We had our first catastrophic mortality from hurricanes last year with Dorian. Prior to that, we might have had one or two mortalities, but we were I was always very proud that the Bahamas had a great safety record as far as being hit with hurricanes. We weren't like Haiti or Hispaniola where they would have, a lot of people die when a storm hit. But that all changed last year. I'm not sure if we do have a final count of the mortalities that we've experienced through Dorian. But one good thing I wanted to mention was, as we know, in East End we had a lot of mortality and a lot of destruction of houses and property. But the one thing that I think is a good story is Sweeting's Key. Sweeting's Key basically had a very healthy, intricate mangrove forest. And while they lost a lot of, probably 100% of their buildings, they didn't lose life. The people who elected to stay in Sweeting's Key were safe. Um, so it's another reason why groups like Save the Bays and Waterkeeper Alliance and EARTHCARE and any other groups that do engage in mangrove planting, we have to continue, and we have to do it more often, I think, because it's going to be able to save lives. This is a slide I don't like to show, but it shows you the impact of Dorian and the storm surge, the 20 to 25-foot storm surge. Above is what Freeport and Grand Bahama normally look like. And below is, I believe at the height of the storm surge, a satellite shot of how much of our island was underwater. And you can see entire subdivisions are affected. And I just can't think about, the friends that we lost. But it's a very eye-opening and disturbing slide. But it is an effect of climate change. So people have been asking me a lot about why we don't have our fresh water back. This was the best slide I could find to try to help to explain it. You can see the purple is the storm surge from a storm. This is not Dorian, but this is just a hypothetical slide. So you've got the storm surge going over onto the land and having, the flooding. But what happens, and you can see in the red, is where the salt water from the storm surge actually sinks into, and it would sink very deep into our substrate, because our substrate is like a sponge. It's calcium carbonate. And so basically what happened is when this storm surge went over the island, it sunk into our freshwater table, which is pretty much, it looks like a lens. And so that's the white portion of this slide. So what's happened is all this salt water that we have, the red, is not moving. It's staying there. And it's a year, 13 months later after Dorian, and we still don't have fresh water in our system. Because well number 6, that big green well, the big green circular tank that you see when you're going on the way to the Lucayan National Park, that was the source of our fresh water for as long as I can remember for the city of Freeport. And that area thankfully never flooded until Dorian. But now that Dorian has hit it, the utility company is finding it very difficult to find parts of the island where they can actually pump water from that are still fresh. So that's why we're still 13 months later getting water from the depots. So basically we've had climate disasters increasing as the decades go on. And unfortunately, most of the places that are negatively impacted by climate-induced disasters are in poor countries or low-lying countries, or countries where people are you're not rich. So a lot of them, once their home is taken away, they don't have the resources to build a new one. They become refugees, what we call climate refugees. And what we've had with Dorian is we actually have climate refugees. We have people whose lives were displaced and totally turned upside down by Hurricane Dorian. They moved out of the country, and some of them aren't planning to come back. They are climate refugees, our Bahamas climate refugees. This is an artist rendering of, I think, Bangladesh. They are very low-lying and are prone to have a lot of flooding when there's big rain events. And this is a photo, actually, of Bangladesh from 2013 after a flood event. This was a town, and basically everyone was stuck on this little piece of land that didn't go underwater. There's more scenes of flooding from climate change. And this is a slide of projections. What they're projecting for the low-lying parts of the U.S. as the sea level rises. And as you can see, the very last slide, basically the lower half of the Florida Peninsula is going to be underwater. And that doesn't bode well for us because we're basically at the same level as they are. So if they go underwater, we're definitely going underwater. Now this is in the Maldives, a very low-lying country, but with a very progressive leader. A few years ago, he was trying to alert the world as to the things that the Maldives will expect after climate change puts their islands underwater. So he had a meeting of his House of Assembly. He had all of his ministers to learn how to dive, scuba dive, and they set up and had a meeting of their ministers underwater to illustrate how dire the consequences are for the Maldives. And that also applies to the Bahamas. We're basically at the same elevation as the Maldives. This particular prime minister has had the foresight to buy. He bought a plot of land on the mainland in another country that was equivalent to the square footage of his country, square miles, so that his people will have a place to move to once his islands go underwater. And one of the consequences is species loss. The polar bears are doing not very well. Their whole lifestyle is based on living on ice, and the ice is melting around them. A lot of the researchers who study polar bears are really saddened because they're seeing a lot of emaciated animals. In Russia, the polar bears are actually coming into the little towns in Siberia and raiding the towns for food because their habitat is being destroyed because of climate change. So there's some animals that are kind of happy about it. This cartoon is tongue-in-cheek, but the sharks are saying, good news, at the current rate of global warming, we should be able to just swim over there and eat that fisherman in a few years, in under 5 years. It's not far from the truth, which is really sad and very alarming to me. So basically, I wanted to leave you with what you can do as an individual. We can't tell countries like the US, well, we can tell them, but whether they listen or not, the US, India, and China, to control their emissions and stop using fossil fuels and switch over to solar or wind or tidal power. But we as individuals in the Bahamas, we can do what we can do, which is use less electricity. If you leave a room, turn it off. Turn off the lights, because the lights and the fan don't need to be on if you're not in the room. So basically, the rule in my house is if you leave a room, you turn off everything, and if you come back, you can turn it back on, but don't leave things just running. It's bad for the environment and it contributes to climate change. So you switch off. We need to recycle as much as possible, because the more new things are made, the more fossil fuels are burned to produce those things. And frankly, I think there's probably enough stuff in the world that everyone has enough stuff that we don't need to make new stuff if you recycle it and take it to the secondhand store. Humane Society of Grand Bahama has a secondhand store. I shop there as much as possible. I also shop at Salvation Army. I don't remember the last time I brought a brand new piece of clothing. Fashion actually is a huge contributor to climate change, because people are treating clothes like disposable bags. They buy a dress, and a brand new dress, and then just wear it once and throw it away or whatever, and then buy a new dress. And that's all contributing to this climate change that's making our lives miserable. Then you can walk more, bicycle, try to limit the amount of times you have to use a fossil fuel based car or truck. And I also want you to look in the chat, because I've posted some links to projectdrawdown.org. That is a group of scientists who have gotten together, and they figured out at least over 80 different things that we can work on that would help to draw down climate change and try to reverse climate change. And I didn't mention, I was able to do a fellowship with Cornell University last year, and our whole fellowship was based on how do we, as scientists or educators or even lay people, how do we communicate to the general public the effects of climate change, and how can we get people to change their behavior such that to do the things I was talking about. Um, and I actually was given by my professor LED lighting, because LED lighting is much less harmful for climate change than other light other lighting systems. So my challenge was to try to get as many people as possible during the fellowship to switch over to LED lights for their houses or office systems. So, but feel free to contact me. I'm earthcare.bahamas@yahoo.com. Our website is earthcare.online. Um, we're happy to help and give any advice, and I thank you for listening to my presentation. Um, and I'm going to open it up to questions. So, does anyone have any questions? You can open your mics. No questions? Hi, Raquel. Okay. Well, thank you for coming, and we'll try and do another one of these at a different time, and I will notify everyone. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am, Miss Gail. Thank you very much for the presentation today. It was good, and I enjoyed it.
Oh, good. Did you learn anything new?
Yes, ma'am. I had no idea that the water water sea level rise had that much of an impact on Grand Bahama.
Oh,
Like
yeah.
seeing that slide where it took over that much land just through that hurricane.
Hmm. Well, over the years, because I lived in Queens Cove for a long time, um, and so you'd have to go past a canal just to get into Queens Cove. And I watched over the years as the high tide mark kept going higher and higher and higher. Um, and you could really see now that we're getting sea level rise. That's why they're building those walls at Smith's Point and the wall they built at Williamstown Beach, because they're afraid of the sea level rise. Hi, Tyler. You still there? Okay. Well, I thank everyone for coming, and I hope we get to see each other next weekend. Thank you.